It's a little bit about me. I do mostly emergency medicine these days. I do some international work. I worked in India. Like I spent a month a year for about 10 years working in a rural area. And now I do some work in Haiti. And I'm on a board of advisors, board of directors of a couple of other organizations that talk about food security, plant-based diet, population, things like that. I have no conflicts of interest, and I do encourage people to check out my website, Plant-Based Data. That's kind of an area of expertise of mine where in terms of plant-based nutrition, food security, and the ecological consequences of our dietary choices there. And okay, so I'll start with a bit of background on this topic, and that is, I'm probably older than a lot of the participants here. I'm not sure if anybody remembers 2003 to 2006. There was a lot of environmental buzz going on, around at the time. Environment's something that sort of goes in and out of fashion, it seems, over the years. And there was the 1-ton challenge that was, all over the radio and everything like that. And at the time, I was listening to all these things. I knew 100% that it was bogus, because you can see what people are talking about, but then you can also observe society around you. And everything around me in society that I could see, and other countries that I traveled to, because I traveled a lot, was all about increasing consumption of everything. And I could not see how you're going to protect the environment and radically grow and increase consumption everywhere at all times. And sure enough, since this time, we have all these fires going on everywhere now. And we look at these charts. This is from the Global Monitoring Laboratory, and the data is in the most recent IPCC report as well. That, if you look at a parameter like carbon dioxide or methane, consistent rise. There's maybe a little bit of a slowdown for methane for a little while, but now it's again rising very rapidly. And we know from the latest IPCC report that methane has about 60% the role of global warming as CO2 does. So it's much more important than people thought it was. Okay, consistent. And all of these things, there was, the Kyoto Accord, Paris, there's Rio, and this, that, and everything. None of those things have ever bent the curve. None have been affected. And now this IPCC report comes out this year, and everybody's like, alarmed about it, who's in the environmental movement. But the general public is, they don't even know what it is, really, mostly. Okay, that people around here that I know when I talk to. And worse than climate change, because everybody always talks about greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, but the real thing that we should be worried about is not just climate change. Climate change is bad because it affects biodiversity, right? The destruction of ecosystems, land, water, soil. It affects humans. It affects biological life. It affects species. And right now we have an extinction crisis, right? And we're in the 6th major extinction crisis of the history of the world. And that is why climate change is bad. But climate change is only one of the causes of this. Okay, so that's what we should be really looking at, and climate change as a subset of the problems. And now we have COP26 coming out, and do we truly see any difference between what was happening in 2003 in terms of what do you see around you? Do we see people responding to this, or do we see, again, just the same old business as usual? Right. So the main points, from sort of part one is that, we've not bent the curve. And oftentimes, what we may be doing is protecting one area, but what global industry does, is displace that exploitation or that consumption to some other area. Generally, what we see over the past couple of decades is from the global north to the global south. That's where we've displaced our majority of our production, extraction, labor in terms of the terrible sort of jobs that people do that are dangerous or not healthy, okay, and low paying. And we should be looking around to see if what people are saying now correlates with what we see in society, right? Politicians or leaders may say certain things that we're going to do and this and that for the environment, but does it correlate with what you actually see going on around you? So we have to know what's impacting the earth if we really want to solve problems. And I feel that when we look at those curves that are not getting better, part of the problem is that people don't even understand what's causing the impact in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to start with people. And these are my friends in Haiti, some of my friends I work with in Haiti, and people I work with in India. It's a beautiful world, it's beautiful people. We all care about so much, that's why we're physicians. And now if you look at people 10,000 years ago, and you look at the total biomass on Earth, okay, humans were less than 1% of the total biomass of vertebrate animals on land. We were a tiny speck amongst many other species, all of whom, relatively had a small biomass relative to the total. But if you look at us today, this is data from Vaclav Smil, a Canadian professor, humans make up about 32% of the land-based vertebrate biomass, and our livestock makes up about 2/3, and wild animals are about 1% of the biomass. Now that's his data. There's other data sets in the same order of magnitude. This one looking at mammals, at the first one, that total mammalian life on land is about 2/3 livestock, 1/3 humans, and about 4% is wild animals. If you look at chickens on Earth, chickens is one species that comes into existence because humans created chickens. They don't exist in nature, right? We've bred them into existence. They outweigh all wild birds. That's about 15 to 20,000 species of birds by 3 times. That's an estimate from one paper. Now, I'll have all the references for you. And if you look at the population on Earth from 1970, I was born in 71, just for reference. So in my lifetime, the human population has doubled. And and animal populations on average that are tracked, and not just animal populations, but other populations of living things too, have dropped on average by 68% just between 1970 and 2017. Okay, this is data from WWF Living Planet report. Okay, so that's the effect on biodiversity. When you look at world population, it grows at about 1%. But that means if you start with 7 billion people, you add 1 billion people to the Earth every 10 to 12 years, okay? We're gonna have 10 billion people by 2050, who we have to feed and treat in some way that they have a good life. They all have a good life as much as possible. Projections by 2021 is we'll have 10 to 13 billion as per UN sort of projections. And that's sort of the moderate projection. And if you look at sort of the extremes of the projection, it could be anywhere from 8 to 16 billion people. And the thing to note is that a very small difference in fertility rates results in a very big change in total population that you'll get over time. And out of these people that living on the Earth right now, we have about 7.8 billion people. These are pre-COVID numbers. There's like 800 million people who are living in extreme poverty. And then so many affected, you can just see the millions there by food shortages, conflict, 40 million modern slaves. That's more slaves than in the time of like when slavery was like legal, okay? Moderate poverty is also very poor, 4.2 billion people living in moderate poverty. That's like $7.5 US per day per person in the family. Yet the global rich are getting richer, not just billionaires, but millionaires, right? That's people like me, okay? And the global poor are actually getting poorer for the past 6 years. People often say, hey, just keep growing and it actually benefits the poor. Well, that was true for a while, but it stopped being true about 6 years ago and really plummeted during COVID. 75% of the land-based system is altered by humans, 2/3 the marine environment, 3/4 of all freshwater systems are used for humans, like livestock use and crops and livestock, 300% crop production increase. We've cut the world's biomass. That means mostly green biomass, mostly trees, by about 50%. We've cut the world's biomass. That's a lot. These are numbers that we should just sit and think about, okay? And 1/4 of everything that grows on Earth is controlled by humans. That's agriculture. And agriculture occupies about 50% of the non-frozen surface of the Earth. And timber harvest has increased so much as well since. Okay. And what we have here, the situation is ecological genocide, though I believe that most people are really unaware because everybody lives in their small bubble, experiencing their life in that small bubble and not sort of what's going on in the greater world. Your experience is limited, although our impact is globalized. We're kind of in this kind of situation. Radical overconsumption is the current norm. And there's an extraction, production, use, distribution, and disposal of all material and energy like on Earth, okay, that's this human activity. These are the sort of the sum of human activity, okay, in these categories of activities is basically killing all life on Earth. And a lot of the things that we use in this process are just used once, right, disposable stuff. Wealth is mostly extracted from the global South, poor countries, to the global North, and impact is mostly into the global South, okay? And it's just our newest version of colonialism, where we're extracting from the global poor and our impacts are mostly on the global poor. And this affects human rights, slavery, and exploitation, sort of this radical inequality that exists on Earth, right? Racism, conflict, wars over resources that are getting worse and worse, and food and ecological sort of, I should put, injustice or justice issues, you could say. Now, this occurs domestically within our own country, but also globally. And there's and we're also sort of wiping out this biodiversity of plants, animals, but also fragmenting and destroying ecosystems themselves, right? It's not just individual species, as I mentioned. And the thing that we really need to think about is that we have to look at the totality of our consumption, right? We have to look at all of our consumption put together, not just one parameter like greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are important, whereas somebody else may look at diet, or somebody else may look at, some other thing, population or whatever. It's not just any one parameter, it's the totality of all these things. And there's something that I've always think about, and I call it the total consumption equation. Is total consumption by humanity is the per person consumption times the number of people, when you just average per person consumption, right? And that's what we have to sort of think about in terms of our impact. You can break that down in different ways. You can also look at it as the sum of each individual, as opposed to a multiplied, average times number of people, average consumption number of people. And you can look at it for kind of products or actions or things like that. You can look at the total sum of all, physical, energy, biological, human impact of any one or all products that we create, right? We can look at just cars, for example, or we can look at all products, whatever. And it's important to do a life cycle analysis of all things, systems, people, products, whatever it might be, and look at items on scale. We shouldn't just think of like, my cell phone here and think of, well, what's the impact of my cell phone? We should think of like, what's the impact when you make 10 million of them, or 100 million of them, or a billion of them? That's what we need to think about. We need to think of, some totals. You can look at time parameters, and you can look at things per country or region or subpopulation as well. We have to think of our consumption sort of in those ways. We have to add it up. So I guess some of the main points just here are that we have to look at the totality of our impact, and sort of, we always oversimplify what's happening on the Earth. And what's happening on the Earth is as complex or more complex than human biology. And we know how complex medicine is, right? But we have these very oversimplified memes or solutions like, oh, electrify everything and just make everything electric and have electric vehicles and that kind of thing. But we don't look at the combined impact of what it would mean to do that kind of thing. For example, if you wanted to electrify everything and have so-called renewable energy, what would be the impact if you scale up solar panels by 200, 300, or 1,000 times, and wind? And what would be the mining impact? Right now, even at the small scale of renewables, so-called renewables that we're doing right now, we're already exploiting people in the global south and causing all kinds of environmental destruction for the extraction of lithium, for copper, for nuclear materials, and all kinds of other rare earth minerals that it takes to produce these things, as well as they have a limited life. And when you dispose of them, they have a terrible impact too. And if you look at the footprint of a car, right, it's not just the gasoline that has the impact, it's the total material, right down to the rubber tires, the paint, the plastic, the wiring, everything has an impact. And you have to look at these things on scale. So is green growth possible? Because we always talk about, hey, let's just keep growing the economy, but we'll just electrify things or make everything renewable or blah, 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 right? So what is growth in the first place, right? Growth is, GDP is a measure of growth. It looks at the total market value or monetary value of goods and services produced in a year, in a country, for example, right? And it's not just a number. You don't just look at the GDP, but it's a biophysical reality. It's how much material, energy, labor, and all these things that we're consuming and that we're experiencing and that we're, extracting, and how that affects us in terms of the benefits we get, the work that we do, and the impact that we have, okay? Growth involves these very real things. It's not just a GDP number. And the answer to the question, like, is green growth possible, is no. Now I have here, these are all different papers, which I'll make available to you, okay? These are all different papers that discuss this idea of decoupling, that will decouple economic growth from the environmental impact. And this is just like somebody says, oh, we'll just decouple things. But all of the available evidence suggests that this is pretty much impossible. It's a biophysical non-reality. We cannot continue to increase our consumption of everything and at the same time decouple it from an environmental impact. this paper by Steinberger and others, just talks about how people's environmental impact correlates with essentially their wealth. Okay, the wealthier we are, the heavier our environmental impact generally is. Okay, and it correlates so well, and it's again an argument. It's just one of the arguments against decoupling. It's not the only one. Some of the Jason Hickel and the other papers that I mentioned talk about the problems with decoupling, right? For example, if you just wanted to decouple energy, let's just focus on energy for a sec. You can never build renewables fast enough to match increasing consumption. Now, for example, some of our leaders may say in the media that, oh, you know what, by 2040, we're going to have half of cars be electric vehicles. But the problem is that by 2040, we'll also have double the amount of cars, which means that you'll essentially have the same number of fossil fuel-based vehicles. But the other thing is that what about the impact of those electric cars themselves? As I mentioned before, this is usually ignored. Okay, and the material impact of everything else besides energy as we continue to grow and consume more is ignored. And also we should note that developing countries or the global south or whatever you want to call it, they all target our Western or rich lifestyle as what they want to achieve. And people are not dumb. I spent a lot of time in India or Haiti or other countries too. They say, that's the standard that is set by the world. That's what we see in media. And that's if other people can have that, it's only fair that I can have that too, right? And so people shouldn't criticize, let's say, China or India for people wanting more and consuming more. They're just following what we're doing, right? There's a lot of other cognitive distortions. Basically, people looking at relative impacts as opposed to absolute impacts. For example, if you say, well, if I make a car that's 30% more efficient, that's great. No, you have to look at the absolute impact. So you may be 30% more efficient, but if you have 50% more cars or 100% more cars, it doesn't really matter that they're 30% more efficient. Your net impact is still greater. Okay, so you have to think about relative versus absolute changes in impact. And don't be fooled by that. And then people have there's this doomism, which, oh, there's nothing you can do, so let's not bother doing anything because we're doomed anyways. That's on one side of these cognitive distortions. And the other one is technological optimism, whereas oh, the economy will solve all the problems and technology will solve all problems, which is also not true. Usually these people, again, they do look at just one parameter and say, well, we'll just look at climate change. And we'll say that we'll electrify everything and then ignore the fact that it'll have all these other consequences, right? You see these kind of things. And it's kind of like, you having this, well, I'll get to it later, having a patient, who let's say wants to eat every junk food, eat every hot dog all the time, and just consume all kinds of stuff and smoke cigarettes and do all these things. And then maybe there's a doctor that all they care about is the blood pressure, and all they want to do is then give them pills for their blood pressure, while ignoring their lifestyle, ignoring their cholesterol, ignoring their diabetes, ignoring their smoking, ignoring the fact that their PSA level may be high, and not screening for any things, not ignoring all that stuff and focusing on one parameter. And certainly, if that's sort of looking at one parameter where blood pressure is kind of analogous to, let's say, climate change or greenhouse gas emissions, and a Tesla or something like that is like blood pressure medications, if you use that analogy, sure, those things are important. They play a role, but you can't just focus on that thing. Okay. And people have other means like, oh, let's just have a circular economy. Well, it's easier said than done, right? Look at recycling right now. Have you ever seen what people throw in a recycling bin? People throw all kinds of stuff in there. And actually, recycling is fake. 94% of things that we throw into recycling in Canada and most other places are actually not recycled. They're just thrown away. And that small percentage that is recycled is often very problematic when they send it to developing countries where people sort through a few things and dump the rest into the environment and then make a profit of recycling a small percentage. So recycling, sort of circular economy, recycling, all these things are very, very, they can be very important, but they're very, very challenging to actually achieve in real life. Okay, and it would require economic overhaul. So some of the main points they're here making is that green growth is really a myth. There's no evidence that it can actually happen. And what we really have to do, what we really actually have to do, which nobody wants to talk about, or very few people want to talk about, I should say, is that we have to actually consume less. And we actually have to share. And this is a big justice issue for the developing world, that the global rich, and much of the global rich actually live in developing countries too, right? The global south. have to actually share, right? We cannot have these levels of inequity, inequity, and these levels of massive consumption. They're not compatible with actually living in on an earth that's not just going to be rapidly degraded as it is right now. It's just actually not physically possible. All right. So if I was just going to use Canada as an example, I'm going to blow through these slides. This just serves as an example to look at the different parameters that we should be observing when we look at total consumption, and just also see what's going on in our own country, right? Canada's role in global overconsumption, we want to look at different levels, like individual, but also systemic, as country, as part of the world, and subgroups within Canada as well, right? Including all the so-called green products, okay? We want to look at the total materials that we consume in terms of like steel, cement, wood, water, soil, plastics, chemicals. We want to look at things in that way. That's how we break it down and conceptualize what we're doing. And we want to look at the products that we're consuming as well. Consumer goods, the large consumer goods, which each product has a very high impact. That means like houses, cars, furniture, appliances, renovations that people do. Everybody wants to renovate with tremendous environmental impact for different renos that we do, and we're just sort of doing it for our own pleasure mostly, and the small stuff as well adds up, all of our electronics, everything we buy at the dollar store, disposables, paper that we use in our computers, Uber Eats and takeout, and and all these kind of things. These all have an impact. We have to look at the net impact of all these things together. Look at energy by type, fossil fuels, renewable, wind, water, air, hydro, things like that, and sector-wise energy. We have to look at our consumption in all these different ways. In urban design and transportation, how do we build our communities? How are we expanding? What's happening with urban sprawl? What's the per person consumption in terms of floor space, size of homes? How many people have secondary homes, vacation homes, cottages, right? These are forms of sort of radical overconsumption, and the material impact and energy impact, land impact of all of these different things. Inherent transportation issues. For example, in my community, we build it in such a way that it doesn't matter if you make better public transportation. We're so sprawled out that public transportation is not effective versus a very compact society. London, UK, and Toronto each have about, the Greater Toronto area, each have about 7 million people, but London is 1/7 the land space of Toronto, and that's why public transportation works well, and it's built around public transportation. You can't do that in Toronto in areas that are very low density. And we should see that, in urban design and transportation, the loss of heritage and green space that's going on with continued urban sprawl. We should look at land use, or agriculture, forestry, conversion of primary forests into secondary forests as we deforest them, sort of loss of large trees, again, urban sprawl, increasing roads, ecosystem fragmentation, and we have to look at that. Agriculture, which is the biggest use of land, and animal agriculture being the single biggest use of land, but also the chemicals, water use, soil loss, and different kind of things that are going on there, and the potential for renewing or rewilding areas too. Okay, and as we pave over our agricultural land, which is happening in many parts of Canada, we are more dependent on importing fruits and vegetables. We should note that the global poor from those countries where we import have less access to those fruits and vegetables, and they already have less than they need in terms of their personal consumption. Biodiversity loss in Canada, we should look at also biodiversity loss that is, that comes as a result of the things that we import from other countries, as well as the waste that we export to other countries. We should look at our weapons industry. Canada is a big offender in terms of the latest big weapons deal that we have in the Middle East. Okay, and other parameters that we should be looking at as well. And the human impact of all our consumption domestically. What are the inherent inequities that build up in terms of race and class within our own country as a result of economic growth, where some people have disproportionate profits and other people are left out of the system, right? And the value, what happens, I think increasingly we're living in a society where people have less value than they used to. We can see these things right in our own lives. Like when I was a kid, I went to school, I still live in Brampton, and in my public school, everybody went to the same public school. You had kids from, people who worked labor jobs, as well as doctors and lawyers. Everybody's kids just sort of went to the same school. Whereas now, pretty much all my colleagues send their kids to private schools. And there's a class distinction right from childhood that wasn't there before. as much. It was a little bit, sure, but it wasn't there as much as it is right now. We should look at the global human rights impact of all things that we do in terms of our, our responsibilities towards international development or lack thereof. Human rights, dealing with oligarchs in different countries. That's what happens in many countries and why they're so bad. Weapons sales and just the economic opportunities we give Global South for trade and developing their economy. And what's our own cost in this economic growth in terms of the time that we have in our lives? I think we live in a society where everybody works a lot for things they don't need and then has very little time for friends, family, and other things. So kind of where we work a lot, but have less time. We have lots of things and less, community and family. There's human consequences to overconsumption. And so when we look at statistics about our consumption, we should analyze and be aware of what those statistics include, exclude, how good the data is, and who collected it, and why, and what is the real story of what's going on around us. We need data to sort of to look at and analyze our own behaviors, and think of life cycle analysis in terms of the problems that we have and solutions, and how scalable are solutions. If we have solutions, are they truly scalable? Right? If we want to have, let's say, more electric vehicles, is that a scalable solution? And what are the consequences if you look at the full life cycle? Right? Canada and the world are pretty much bent, hell-bent on economic growth, okay? This is the GDP growth of Canada and USA, okay? This is what's going on. And if you look at Canada's GDP growth over the years, there's times when we regress, when there's some kind of like a recession or something like that, but we start, our growth starts punching back up again very quickly, all right? And aside from those stats, if you're looking at those stats, does that correlate with what you see in real life? Again, we want to just look at our real life and see. And I think it does, like everything around me, everywhere you go, people are buying cars, houses, stuff, everything. We are consuming ever more. Right? You can see that around you. So that does correlate with what we see in terms of economic growth, and the stats correlate. And, we see all these things like the government over here wanting to pave over everything, this massive amounts of urban sprawl and loss of farmland around the Toronto area and everywhere in Ontario, and I think in other places around Canada too. And we can look what the banks are doing. We may be talking about all these eco things, but the banks are part of the financial system. They're not sort of separate from, they're kind of interrelated with government, industry. All these things are interrelated. The finance industry is part of that. And when you look at where finance is going, they may be talking about, there may be talk about like, green growth or this or that or everything like that. But here's where the money is going. The money is going towards the fossil fuel industry, big time, okay? All this stuff is just talk. Look at where the investments are actually going into. Look at where dollars are being spent, okay? And how the financial and industrial system actually works. And it's not just the financial and industrial system and government, it's consumers. This is what also consumers, this is what people want, okay? People want to buy all this stuff, right? There's steady and deliberate population growth in Canada, and this is a driver also for economic growth, okay? That as we increase our population, it's part of a planned economic growth, okay? In my own lifetime, I think Canada's population has doubled too, okay? Just as the world has. And you can see sort of, we're about 1%, but this year we're more than 1% in terms of our growth. And when we look at our consumption in our primary energy consumption in Canada, okay, for the things we do, you can see that it's growing, right? And electricity production by source and fossil fuel consumption of Canada, let's say, as compared to a place like the United Kingdom, which is actually dropping somewhat. That's good for them, but not places like US, Canada, Australia, Per person energy consumption may be kind of plateauing, but it may be missing the amount that we consume that is occurring in different countries for the things that we import, okay? And import data may be underestimated too in some cases when you do factor that in. Also, we're not, remember, this is just energy use and not the total material footprint of all the things that we consume, right? So remember, not just to look at energy, but to look at everything, okay? And also, the number of people are increasing, so you have the same number of per capita consumption, but more people. So net consumption is actually growing, right? And sort of looking at our emissions, so what is excluded in this chart is the total greenhouse gas emissions, excluding land use and forestry. Wow, okay, we should be including that too, whatever we do include that, and the other things that I was mentioning before too. Greenhouse gases by sector, we should look at that. And annual number of vehicles in Canada, it's steadily increasing along with our economic growth, our use of fuels, etc. These are new car sales in Canada, right? We can see there's, if you go up the scale, it's just increasing, dips when there's a financial crisis like in 2009, and then pumps back up again. And in terms of our place in the world, we can see where, this is the emissions gap report from the United Nations 2020 and UNEP. And they look at sort of the top 1%, how much do they consume versus like the bottom 50%, the middle 40%, the top 10%, how much does each person consume and where are we along that curve? And Canada is way up there. Another similar graph, okay? I'm not gonna linger on it, but most people don't know that if you earn about $40,000 Canadian, 32 US, if you earn about 40K Canadian, you're part of the 1%. People don't know that. And that's less than what people think it is. That number surprises people. They didn't realize they were part of the global 1%. And the reason is because there's so many poor people in the world. Okay, the denominator is very big. Okay, you're not the 1% of Canada, but you may be the 1% of the world. Okay, and total income growth in Canada. Okay, so income didn't grow that much for Canadians in the 0 to 90th percentile. But once you hit the top 10% of Canada, which probably most of us are in actually here, people have very good growth in terms of their personal incomes. Okay, and net worth too. So Canada is based on radical overconsumption. We have to consume less. And we have to share what we have with the developing world. That is realistically the truth if we want to actually become more sustainable, rather than having just more and more fake solutions that don't really do anything, sound great at the time, but don't really do anything. All right. So economics. So why do economics matter in the genocide? Okay, this is ecological genocide. So, tracking ecological overshoot the human economy. There's lots of papers that date back more than 2 decades actually talking about economics and our ecological overshoot. This is not a new thing. Economics is basically the science, social science that looks at the production, distribution, consumption of goods and services, and studies how individuals, businesses, governments, nations make their choices about resources and things like that. This is from Investopedia. There's a little supply and demand curve there. There's microeconomics, macroeconomics. You can't really get into that here. But why is it important? It's because we're looking at all the things that we're, again, extracting, producing, using, disposing. We're looking at labor, energy, materials. From where do we get these things and who gets what, jobs, money, and stuff, right? Like this is, and what are the impacts? This is what economics concerns itself. So there's environmental economics, which looks at how to incentivize, disincentivize, and sort of, change the variables of our consumption. There's ecological economics. There's another definition that looks at sort of economics as a balance or as a subset of what's going on in the biosphere in the world, and really aims to balance human activity with the natural world, while also looking at equity, health, well-being of all humans. And it's kind of antithetical to this infinite growth paradigm. That infinite growth paradigm of economics is very different than ecological economics. And that's something that we need to think about. And that's where degrowth comes in. So degrowth is a ecological economics, environmental economic concept, sorry. And the idea is that it's a system-wide solution. It's not based on just individual choices. It's planned by society, systemic, where you have sort of reduced material and energy consumption in totality and per person, as well as total consumption, improving our forms of consumption so that they do have lower impact and better value for our life, and reducing population at the same time, because that's a factor in total consumption, but also increasing our quality of life, health, equity, rights for Canada and abroad, so that we also have a better impact on the rest of the world. So, at the same time of having this ecological economics concept, this degrowth concept, my belief, my view, and if you look at people like Jason Hickel, whatever, you can do this while making a better life in a society that's still dynamic, interesting, and incredible place to live. It shouldn't look as something that, oh my God, it's a punishment to us. It should look like something that's actually a good opportunity to live a better life, right? And it's our job to manifest something like degrowth, should it happen, in a way that achieves that. So here's the definition of degrowth according to Jason Hickel. He's one of the sort of political economists, philosophers, environmentalists that really talks about this. I recommend his book, Less is More. Degrowth is a planned reduction of energy and resource use designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. Can we just look at that part there? Now, is there evidence that there are of low consumption societies that are actually happy and healthy? Is there evidence of that, right? And I think that there are. I don't know if anybody's heard of the blue zones or like a country like Bhutan or Costa Rica and other places. There's lots of, and even not looking at a country, but looking at a subsection of our society or other countries and societies, we can find examples right in Toronto or wherever you live, I think, of people who consume less but live very high quality, healthy lives, right? So I think that there is evidence of this on national levels, regional levels, and personal levels, okay? I can certainly say that the best times in my life, and I've experienced many places and people and times when I was consuming the least, but having the best times in my life too. And what does a well-planned, low-consumption, happy, healthy society look like? Let's just use our imagination for a second. It's going to be a place where you have less stuff. You have a smaller living space, a compact community, so you don't need a car because you can walk everywhere. It's human friendly. Less cars. I'm going to put series less cars. Less exclusivity, less privatization of things, less private golf courses, but more public parks. So there are less privatization of, let's say, like nature is being privatized. I mentioned cottages. Like that's a very, very exclusive thing. Whereas, and there's a whole class of people who never get to experience nature. That is sort of the private wealth. Instead of private wealth, you have public wealth. And instead of private luxury, you have public luxury. People could have more time, more community, more hobbies, eco hobbies, not like racing your big sports cars necessarily. Public services, cheap or free education, healthcare, children's camps, equity rights, etc. Those are the kind of things. That's the kind of society that we would want to target. Okay, what kind of policies would be in place to achieve that? So you'd want to have sort of an education system that teaches people why this is important in the first place, not like propaganda, but like science-based, okay? There would be progressive types of taxes on consumption, on excessive material things that people possess, okay? You would have, you might, for example, tax things progressively. So you get a certain amount of energy at a certain price, but as we consume more, the price increases, just like our income tax does. So there's an incentive to stay within boundaries and consume less. Sure, people who have more money can consume more, but it gets progressively more expensive, let's say. That's just an example of a type of taxation that you would have on consumption, right? Increased services, like we talk about healthcare, education, and costs may be oriented towards accountability, right, of the public using those services, but still making them accessible. Material and energy costs, you would have sort of, you couldn't have unlimited cheap stuff. There's eco taxes on consumption according to impact and according to quantity consumed, let's say. Okay, you'd have a repair economy where you buy things that are meant to last a long time and you make them repairable. You actually legalize that. Right now, when I was a kid, most things lasted for a long time and you could repair them. Now things break down, you throw them away, you get a new one. Okay, that's a difference. That's an intentional difference that is made by industry to accelerate consumption and accelerate and sort of drive the economy, which sure, it has certain benefits to us right now, but it is destroying the planet, right? You restrict things like disposables. Things will actually cost more, okay? You end planned obsolescence. Cost more, but they should last a long time, okay? So these are some of the kind of policies you put in place, and people would have to try to mentally wrap their head around that. Yeah, less cheap stuff, okay? But you can subsidize it for those who are poor. You don't want it to be inaccessible to poor people. You'd want to, let's say, have a reduced population, but you'd want to prioritize humanitarianism, right? So make things really good for those people who do come here or children who are born, but you want to have good family planning. You want to have prioritize for people like refugees, right? Prioritize indigenous people, people who suffer from racism, racial inequality, and things like that. Right now, a lot of places in the country, you don't know it, but schools are funded according to the tax bases that surrounds them. So if you live in a rich community, your school gets more funding compared to a poor community. That's wrong, right? You want to have more, and that inherits, that reinforces racism when people live in poor communities. The war economy, we talked about, weapons exports and supporting, making money off of things that eventually will hurt people for sure. Okay, housing becomes more cheap and affordable when population is stable. Cheaper if it population actually shrinks, which is kind of what we would want to do, right? Think about, again, the amount of humans there were on Earth 10,000 years ago compared to now, right? If you want to decrease Canada's impact or the global impact, developed countries need to decrease their consumption as much as developing countries do, right? Developing countries have differential impacts when they grow their population. For example, when I'm in Haiti, and I'm staying with the family that my sort of Haitian family, right? We use charcoal to cook. We're cutting down all the trees, right, for charcoal. That's a different impact than we have in Canada, where we don't use charcoal. But people over there will literally cut down the last tree if it means heating themselves, heating or cooking or eating or something like that. People will do that if you need to. You'll kill the last elephant, whatever. People want to survive, right? Compared to us, we have in Canada, compared to the global poor, people have 20 to 100, sometimes even 1,000 times more consumption per person in developed countries. One person over here can consume so much, and we need to reduce our population because our per person consumption is extraordinary. And let's say you want to half Canada's consumption, if you double our population, which is what 1% growth or 2% growth will actually do to us, people would have to have a quarter of the consumption, and that's not socially acceptable out here. You'd have to fight tooth and nail to do that. So, one of the things that we need to do is also stabilize population. All right, in developed countries everywhere. We need greater equity globally, domestically. Okay, and things like look at the businesses. I'll talk about like reduce the wealth gap and have fair investment or savings that are not like the way it is right now. Like right now, the global rich have access to investments and savings that exponentially multiply their money compared to the global poor or the poor within our own country, okay? Things that people like Jason Hickel talk about is reduce advertising and their complete desire and addiction for getting more stuff. We would want, in terms of labor, we would want shorter working hours, right? Why not have shorter working hours? Let's have more time. But you would also need, if you're producing less stuff, there may be less jobs. So we would probably want to increase employment in service sectors, right? Healthcare, care of the elderly, for kids, all kinds of things, and greater work distribution. Guaranteed basic income would be a tool that we would use as well, like negative income tax schemes, which I'm not going to explain right now, but that's a concept I learned when I was studying in my economics course back in university, that I remember very well. Actually, I was very impressed by it. And businesses, there'd be still a role for big businesses, but right now it's kind of winner take all. You can see that happening over the past decades, where small businesses are completely always going out of business in Toronto area and elsewhere, taken over by larger chains, larger businesses. But we would want to still have a role for big guys, but also much more role for little guys who can operate more ecologically and can also produce things locally, have less packaging and things like that too. So we'd want to have policies that protect the environment, expand protected areas, restrict activities that have high ecological impact, singular activities, but also activities which on scale have a big impact. Do ecosystem restoration work. We'd want to have policies that work with the global south in terms of sustainable development, knowledge sharing, and stop our interaction with developing countries where you're essentially dealing with oligarchs and supporting the rich in those countries to control those countries, profit a lot, and then give us cheap resources while exploiting the poor people in those countries. That's the kind of relationship that we have with most countries in the global south as we extract from them so much, right? And have more ethical transactions and work in development with people in developing countries to actually get results. Like, for example, when I'm working in Haiti and I look what international organizations are doing, I just think like, it's a joke. They have no vision, they don't even think on a systems level, like how to get kids in school, let's say, okay? Something that should be able to be done, okay? Policies for food and agriculture, like protecting land from actually being paved over, restoring some lands to rewilding, having more plant-based diets. I love the example of the Three Sisters, which Aboriginal people throughout the Americas, most of the Americas, had some form of the Three Sisters: beans, corn, and squash, and restricting types of packaging, disposals, and the way we transport food. Curating a dynamic and interesting society to live in. Those are the kinds of things we want. We want to have people able to not just watch sports, but play, participate in arts, community, whatever that they're going to do that's going to lead to a dynamic and healthy lifestyle, okay? Minimize forms of consumption or travel, let's say they're very exclusive or exploitive and have high impact, and find ways to create enjoyable travel that are actually low impact. ultimately, we're going to have hard limits on material and energy use, but have equitable and humane use staying within those limits. All right. And just, have this dynamic society. It's not about creating a utopia. I think this would be a very difficult ongoing process, kind of like our healthcare system, right? We have a great healthcare system. I like to compare it to the US. However, it's always getting upgraded, changing according to the needs, et cetera. There's always squeaky wheels that need to be, repaired and so forth, and changed and evolve. And, personally, I don't like to use the words like capitalism and socialism in terms of describing, degrowth. I think we need to get beyond those things. These are some things that I just stole a slide from Bill Rees in our recent Cape conference that was in BC. I'm not going to go through each one of them. I mentioned this already. Degrowth is not, as per me, communism or socialism or capitalism or anti-capitalism. We just have to get a little bit smarter than all of those things, incorporating some of the principles, the lessons though that we learn. There are a lot of barriers, I think, to this. It's a major paradigm shift for the majority of people. And there's a lot of cultural momentum. There's a lot of vested interest. Imagine a lot of the rich people in our society suddenly having to share their wealth or be taxed more, et cetera. Okay. And truthfully, I believe that the global north, most rich people are very, very sheltered from the effects of environmental degradation. I think we overstate, realistically, we say, oh, climate change is going to ruin life for all of us. No, it's not. I don't think so. I think that the global rich are very, very protected. At least, and in Canada, we're very protected. There are some effects on us, and some people will be affected. You'll see some flooding somewhere and it's going to be terrible. But generally speaking, those people will be safe. They'll move somewhere else. They're going to be okay. But the real vast majority of impacts are going to be on the global poor. Okay. And most people, again, live in their bubbles. When I go outside and I go anywhere and I interact amongst my friends, people are just totally unaware of this stuff. Okay. And they don't really want to change. They're enjoying their lifestyles getting richer, actually, most of them, okay? And they enjoy exclusivity. There will be even violent opposition by some if you start talking about this. And I think concurrently, we need a moral revolution. I think that achieving this thing could be great if we could, but it would be very hard. But also realistically, it's the only thing that would actually turn around the environmental degradation that we're facing right now. And where do we need to start? I think the first thing, like I do a lot of work in the sort of plant-based world, right? If you talk about plant-based diet or veganism or something like that 20 years ago, people didn't even know what the heck you were talking about. It was very unpopular. If you did talk about it, you get a lot of resistance. You still do, actually. And however, it needs to start somewhere, because you can see 20 years, now people sort of see more and more of the information regarding plant-based diets or whatever it might be. And there's lots and lots of evidence for it. You can check my website and see all the science that's there. The science vastly exceeds public awareness. But the conversation and the knowledge and the research and the thinking have to start somewhere. And I think in terms of stopping, you're not going to degrow right away. You probably want to start with just stopping like the radical growth that we actually have right now. And COVID provides lessons on what you do with people in terms of, if you have changes in their income stream, then how do you manage that? All right. So just in conclusion, I think, what I want to say is that, I hope I've sort of provided sort of this sort of picture of this evidence of like how deep the ecological crisis really is, and humanitarian crisis that is entwined with that, really. And how most people around the world, especially the global rich, are really minimally aware, and that's a very difficult situation. That radical overconsumption in its totality is the cause. We should not be looking at a single parameter, like just looking at climate change or greenhouse gas emissions, which will result in sort of false kind of solutions. And there's lots of false solutions. I should have included that in the previous slide of barriers. There's, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, false solution. You'd have to cut down all the trees in the world to compensate for just a fraction of our greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon capture and storage, clean coal is promoted. The fossil fuel industry has all kinds of things that they promote. This whole thing of regenerative grazing, scientifically bogus, but people promote it a lot because there's profit to be made out of it. A lot of false solutions out of there too. And part of the reason is you're looking at a single parameter, right? And then you say, oh, we can change the parameter, but then there's a cost somewhere else, and that other cost is massive, all right? So what we really need to do is we do need to reduce our consumption, but it can be done in a systemic way that leads to a better quality of lifestyle and a better life for everybody. It can be done, but it's a hard thing to do because there are those barriers that I mentioned, and it's a foreign concept to most people. Okay, but this is the concept that I believe that environmental organizations they don't want to talk about it in most cases, right? Just like they never used to want to talk about, let's say, plant-based diet, but they sort of got their hand forced to do that when things came more into the media. But this is a concept that I think will be talked about more, and that environmental organizations like CAPE should take a leadership role, because as one organization does it, it brings legitimacy to other organizations to do the same. And this has to become what our environmental education is centered on. Right now, we have environmental education that somebody's talking about population, somebody about climate change, somebody about maybe plant-based diet, somebody's talking about everything. We're not talking about the net totality of our consumption and how we have to look at that and think about how you can have a better lifestyle while consuming less. And that's where the conversation needs to go. It has to be technical, has to be supported by science. And there is a lot of science looking at the different consumption of different things. And I will share with you my folder on environmental economics, where you see a lot of papers there as well, because I think that, as physicians, we are trained to sort of practice evidence-based medicine, and that's what we should apply to environmental problems as well. We have to look at the science and the evidence for things and look at it critically, look at, not just believe a paper, let's say, but take apart what the paper says and what it doesn't say as well, using the same skills that we have. So that's everything. Sorry, it's a lot of slides and a lot of material, but I hope there's a little bit of time for questions. And if you guys want to stay a little longer than just the hour that we allocated, that's okay with me if anybody wants to.